Welcome back to the Village Bonfire for another episode of the Wild Sacred Journey podcast. A podcast not just for your mind, but for your body and spirit too. Here we don't just talk theory. Instead, we compassionately engage with our lived experiences and a wide variety of topics together, all to invite the question, in these times we find ourselves in, how do we be more human? Thank you for being here. May these conversations awaken, inspire, repair, and evolve something deep within each of us and serve the wild, tender aliveness of our personal and collective hearts. Welcome back to another episode of Wild Sacred Journey podcast. So once again, this is your host and fire tender, Kate Powell. Yeah, so let's just take a couple deep breaths in and out to start. Light our candle, our village fire. Perhaps letting the flame of that just gently enter your heart today, warming and lightening the center of your chest, the space between your shoulder blades, perhaps also then your neck, your shoulders, your upper chest, your jaw. The muscles and connective tissue around your eyes. All around your skull. And as the gentle light of our fire, our candle, brings some warmth, a melting, maybe a gentle melting or softness through our upper body, through our head. We let that just trickle down your spine. Letting that gentle softening, that warmth, soften your belly, your pelvis, your low back, your tailbone, all the way down your legs. Letting the soles of your feet soften so that instead of if they have been feeling like they're almost subtly lifting up away from the earth, they relax down to be held by it. Letting air flow in and out as your breath. Letting your heart beat, your blood pump, fluid. So that all the elements of your physical body that mirror the elements of nature just gently settle into some sort of harmony in this moment. And so, as I've mentioned before, you might have heard me mention before, I don't necessarily plan what I'm going to say in those moments. And yet they always seem to flow in relationship with what I'm speaking about today. And so, something that's been a lot on my mind and my heart recently has been this. You may have heard, if you've been around a little while, you've probably heard me speak about culture, right? And so this idea that we have inner and outer culture, and that actually when we step into sort of this realm of, if we want to call it shamanic vision, or if we want to call it intuitive vision or ancestral perception vision, right? Whatever that is, when we step into this space where we're recognizing the subtle aspects of our experience, as well as then like the more tangible, more physical aspects of our experience, right? When we're stepping into this space where we understand that we have a subtle body as well as a physical body, and that we have energy fields within and around our bodies, then it becomes like that biological definition of culture, right? And so we have this, there's culture, like in the sense of like the systems we create, the art we create, the foods we eat, the languages we speak, the stories we tell, right? So there's like that kind of culture. But then there's also, the biological definition. So cultures being the petri dish, the environment in which a cell grows, and that informs the cell's growth, right? And so that can be the culture that we're born into, those languages, those systems, those foods, those thought patterns, those, stories, all of that, the art. It can also be our energy fields, and our energy fields can store our traumas. They can store ancestral and generational traumas. They can store traumas from past life. They can store aspects of the collective conscious and the collective unconscious, right? So our energy fields are like little record keepers, right? But they're not record keepers in the sense of like written tradition record keepers, like it's written and that's it, right? They're record keepers more in that oral sense of record keeping, oral tradition sense. So this sense of like there's certain elements that are important to kind of have passed down, but then there's also a certain fluidity, there's an adaptability, there's a flexibility. And so, one of the things in these times, one of the ideas, main themes of this podcast is like in times that feel really soul starved, in times where there's a lot of dehumanizing forces and systems at play in our world, how do we be more human, right? And so, there's a lot of like outward action aspects of that. And it's important that these things go hand in hand, because there's also a lot of inward action, right? There's a lot of unlearning of these cultural pieces that are stored in our energy fields, in our bodies, right? That hold these, that hold the status quo of inner culture that we need to shift, I don't know, maybe that's not the right word. Seems important to me in these times, if we're holding this question of how do we be more human? How do we be more human? How do we be more human, right? In the face of really sometimes big, unstoppable, almost inevitable feeling, really dehumanizing feeling forces, right? Like, how do we keep choosing humanity, right? And by humanity, I don't mean human supremacy, but I mean the part of us that belongs in this world, right? To this world, of this world, right? And so it's like, yeah, we've internalized a lot of the outward culture, right? And it's stored in our inner culture. And so we also have to, as we're shifting the outer culture, we also have to shift the inner culture, so that our cells literally have a different environment to grow in. Our mind literally has a different space it can create neural pathways in, right? And so one of the things I've been sitting with a lot in some of my interpersonal relationships right now, as well as then like the larger global picture of the world, is like, a lot of times our mind finds it easier to think of things in terms of dualism, right? And there's a certain aspect of that, right? Like there's a lot of seemingly opposing forces that seem to help keep things in balance, that seem to help keep things, and by things I mean aliveness, actually. Like I mean it also not just like in the human created systems, but also like in the nature-based systems. There's a lot of dualism present. There's a lot of seemingly opposite things that help hold in balance, right? But I'm drawing a distinction between dualism and duality, and maybe you would use the two terms in the opposite direction that I'm using them. But there's a sense of so within complex systems, while there may be many different sort of seemingly opposing forces at play, we're also looking at the bigger picture of how all of those are also then dancing with each other, right? And we recognize that actually it's an and space where those things have to literally, in order to create life force energy, creativity, spark, right? We have to like that healthy conflict, healthy tension, healthy opposition is actually inevitable and necessary, right? And so once we recognize that, we can actually step into and space, right? Where the opposition, the conflict, the tension becomes healthy because we recognize the larger part that it's playing, and it's allowed to align itself with aliveness, with love, right? As opposed to then duality, which is this either or space, which usually aligns itself more with fear, right? Or fragmentation, right? Because it can't be both. So suddenly opposition, suddenly conflict, suddenly tension creates rupture, but rupture that doesn't have a container that allows it to repair, right? Rupture that doesn't have a container that channels it into aliveness, life force energy, creativity, love, right? Rupture that becomes destructive, not in the sense of life, death, life, destruction, the destruction inevitable in aliveness, right? The death inevitable in aliveness, but destruction in the sense of like counterproductivity. And so, you know, we tend to then, when we're in this duality space, this mindset of either or, then there's a lot more vilification that happens. There's culture of dehumanization that can happen. Exile, fragmentation, right? And so in that space, we assume violence or war is the opposite of peace, right? But in this broader sense of things, perhaps the opposite of violence or war isn't peace, but care or love, right? And maybe it's peace, but that's if your definition of peace includes care and love, right? Peace can be a very passive state of being, and it's often taught that way, right? We often go to yoga or meditation or whatever it is to quote unquote achieve peace, right? And usually in that moment, the underlying sort of assumption of what that word means is some sort of somewhat monotone state of being, right? Neutral, no extreme highs or lows, right? So in that sense, peace can also mean bypassy, right? It can also mean freeze, right? So there's these undertones with peace that sort of is actually, again, this stepping out of the river of aliveness, this stepping out and away and vilifying our own humanity, right? Because in that moment, usually the quote unquote violence that we're working to calm is our own inner state, right? And while we do have internalized violence, it's not usually what we think it is. I would posit that the internalized violence we experience in that moment is actually our rejection of our own complexity. So I see this all the time with myself. I see it with clients, right? Like what we're doing in that moment is we're punishing ourselves for being human. Instead of active verbs, love, care, which means we recognize rupture is inevitable. In the same way, like if you're trying to start a fire with matches or with a striker or with a bow drill, right? You're creating friction. You're creating some blow. There is a violence, quote unquote, in that action, right? And that creates the spark. But then you have to catch the spark, right? You have to tend the spark. You have to care for the spark. When you're beating a drum, there's a hitting involved, right? And then there's a pause to let the reverberation happen, right? There's a call and a response. When you're walking on the earth, your feet hit the earth. And then there's some sort of pause and rhythm and repair, right? Atoms crashing into each other, right? There's these things happening that are part of aliveness. And if it's within a container of love and care, it becomes creative. It becomes as well as destructive, right? Like it becomes all of the things instead of too much of one thing or none of the things, right? So I'm talking about this a little bit because one of the things that I think we find we're like one of the outer cultures that we've really internalized a lot, particularly in the US, but it's not just us, is punitive repair, quote unquote repair, right? So it's taking moments where a rupture has happened and it's increasing rupture. It's meeting rupture with more rupture. It's meeting rupture with exile and further fragmentation, right? And sometimes distance is the repair. But again, is it happening in the sense of either or, in the sense of fear, in the sense of denial, in the sense of vilification, in the sense of dehumanization? Or is it happening from a context and a container of love and care? Right? And so for quote unquote messy emotions that I think are often overruled in these like quote unquote peace practices, but which come up all the time as humans, and I think are some of the ones that we see that inner punitive culture really come out in how we respond to them, right? Judgment, anger, shame, and guilt, right? So in a lot of spiritual practices, we have this goal of bypassing judgment. Oh, I should be non-judgmental. I should be accepting, right? There's a difference between accepting, which can mean seeing and honoring the complexity of a situation, versus being judgmental. So again, are those things actually opposites? Not necessarily, right? So the opposite of acceptance is actually more like resistance, right? And judgment is actually a tool letting us know something is or isn't for us. So judgment, when used healthily, is actually discernment. When wielded as a weapon against somebody else, what is right or wrong for me needs to be exactly the same for you, right or wrong for you. Then it becomes a weapon, right? Because then it becomes punitive. Then it becomes a force of oppression or then punition or vilification, dehumanization, trying to create sameness where life wants to be diverse, where life wants to be complex, right? Anger as an emotion shows up when someone has transgressed our boundaries, right? Or when boundary rupture has happened and boundaries need to be repaired. So that can be a beautiful tool. So again, if we then lash out at the person and treat rupture with more rupture, then that actually can become violence. That becomes either or. That becomes we cannot coexist, right? And again, distance is not inherently a bad thing. So sometimes rupture repair looks like distance, looks like a certain level of disconnection. But where are we coming from with that disconnection? And we can't always do this by ourselves. It should not be on the person who has experienced the rupture. They have a certain responsibility for their part of whatever the interaction was and whatever the repair is, right? But it's not on them to meet that by themselves. It shouldn't be. We're meant to do this in community, right? But we vilify our anger, right? And go, oh, I shouldn't be angry. I should be peaceful, Anger leads to violence, right? And we say that because we see it happen time and time and time and time and time again in our culture. Anger does usually lead to violence, but mostly because underneath the anger is fear, as opposed to anger that is directed by love, which says, because boundaries at their heart are the lines that we need to draw so that we can still love ourselves and another person, not either or, and. So if you stay on this side of this line, I can love me and you. If you cross this line, I will no longer be able to love me and you. I will have to choose between one or the other. Right? So it's still about love. Shame. So shame is kind of an interesting one. So shame and guilt. So guilt is actually more, my understanding anyway, and what I experience it as is guilt is more of an internal thing. When I'm feeling guilty, it's because I've transgressed my own or someone else's boundaries. So guilt is my own checking system. Something's off here. I'm out of integrity. I need to figure what that is, right? I need to come back into alignment. I've now been the perpetrator of violence. I've been the cause of rupture. Right? Shame is an internalized perception of how others are viewing us. So shame is how society kind of controls us. Right? And again, that's not inherently a bad thing. If society does so in a punitive either or, increasing rupture, increasing exile kind of way, then yes, shame's not helpful. Right? So there's a lot of rhetoric that's I hear sometimes starting now, like, oh my gosh, I should never be anywhere where I feel shame, right? But if we look at a world where everybody's shameless and everybody's guiltless and everybody's like all of these other things, right? We're kind of looking at a world that sounds a little bit like it could be heading in the direction of like sociopaths, like a whole bunch of sociopaths, right? We are interconnected. We do have a certain responsibility for ourselves and to and for each other and the world around us, right? So coming up against experiencing the ripple effects of our own actions mirrored back to us by others is not only not wrong, it's also inevitable and also kind of healthy. Again, depending on the culture in which it's happening. Is it happening from a culture that loves and cares and affirms humanity and says that action might not have been great? Doesn't mean you yourself are horrible, but you should maybe check on what you're doing or what you're saying, right? And so that's not inherently a bad thing. That's part of how we learn. It's part of how we interact with each other. Letting it shrink us, letting it dehumanize us, turning it into a punishment, internalizing it in ways that then we make it up ourselves and imagine it's happening to us and then respond as if it were when maybe it isn't. That's not helpful, right? But re-looking at shame and guilt and our relationship to them and what culture they're actually coming from within us or from around us is really important to letting these things actually, again, help us be more human rather than less human, help us create inner and outer cultures that are more loving, that are more just, that are more caring, that are more alive, right? And so, I love in Irish and Gaeilge, and I think there are some other languages that do this a little bit more than English does anyway, for sure, which is like, when you're talking about an emotion, you don't say, I'm sad. You would say like, sadness is on me, right? So again, there's that drawing that distinction. I am responsible for my actions. My actions are not me. I am responsible for my emotions. My emotions are not me. They're one of the threads in the tapestry that make up me, whatever that even means. But they're not, they come and go. They're messengers. They're just showing up,
pointing us to something, trying to deliver us a message, helping us figure out what steps to take, helping us figure out how to relate to other people, right? They're just part of this really messy experience, right? And so when we can learn to like work with sort of these things, how can they help us navigate difference? How can they help us navigate interdependence? And like, I don't have perfect answers for that because I think a lot of it is unique to each of us and our personal experiences. You know, there's a lot of common themes, common threads, common trajectories I see in sessions with clients. And there's a lot that's unique about each of those things. And we each kind of have to find our way with them, right? Because we are all different. Right. And I also don't have answers because I'm really on this journey myself. Like, it's really fucking hard some days, right? But it seems really crucial to me in these times and in this question of like, how do we not keep perpetuating? How do we not become a force of dehumanization in the world? How do we push back against them? How do we reclaim things? How do we create something new? And so, you know, I do think, like, again, the inner and outer has to be happening at the same time. My personal medicine for the world tends to be working more with the inner. So that's more what I speak to because that's more what I help people with. But obviously, like going off into a cave and just like, you know, what some people call navel gazing, right? Like going inward and just picking ourselves apart, like that's not helpful either. And guess what? I mean, you can even feel into that. If you were to just go, okay, I'm just going to work on myself, just going to work on myself, just going to work on myself, right? Like, oh my God, everything in the world's so messy. I need to just work on myself, right? Like, does that feel like a culture of love and care? Or does that feel like a culture, a punitive culture, right? A culture of more violence, of more rupture, right? So it's like the culture behind what we're doing matters immensely, almost more than the what. We can be messy and make mistakes. And if we are doing it from our bestest intended hearts, right? The best we have to give in that moment, the most loving we are capable of being in that moment, then that's repair. It's not perfect, but it's repair. And so, yeah, we don't have to be perfect. We just have to keep choosing love to the best of our ability in that moment and not, oh, well, I chose love. like, like keep getting curious. Was that really love? Where was that love still influenced by fear? Where was that love still influenced by a punitive idea of what love is, a limited idea of what love is, a sameness idea of what love is, right? And we just have to keep being curious, right? But curious with love. Again, to the best of our ability. And we just got to keep working that muscle and keep working that, right? Because then that brings us into a place where we become more whole and intact. The more able we are to be with like all these different threads that make us up, right? Like we are, it's like for me, this image of a spider comes up a lot, right? Like if we're at the spider's web, but in this case, like all the different threads of the web are like feeding into the spider. So all the ancestors of ours who've come before, all the people who've touched our lives and whose lives we've touched, right? Like even acquaintances, bugs, animals, right? Like all of that, the places where we've lived, the food where we've eaten, the land that we've been on, right? The stars that we look up to, all of that stuff, like weaves in to create who we are. We are somehow like a gathering place for all the threads of all these different things, each one of us, right? Our own little gathering place. And then it's like it's like a big cauldron, right? I'm mixing metaphors now, but whatever, we're going with it. Big cauldron, and all these ingredients are put in. And then we alchemize them into something, right? Into our thread, the thread that comes out of us and into the world, the expression of ourselves. And so being whole and intact means we have a capacity to keep doing that alchemizing, to keep looking at what are the ingredients in this soup? Is this, or this potion or whatever we want to call it, right? Is it making a harmonious, good tasting thing? Is it making medicine or is it making poison? Right. And medicine sometimes is bitter, right? So maybe it's not always good tasting, but like, is it making something that serves love, that serves aliveness, right? And if not, what ingredients do we need to take out? What ingredients do we need to stop putting in? What ingredients do we need to focus a little bit more on alchemizing, turning them into something else individually before they can then become part of this soup, this potion, this medicine, right? And so being whole and intact means that we can be that cauldron that can hold all of those parts. And we're not like leaking some out or like grasping after some over here, right? And it means we can then be more effective in being present. We can respond more accurately in the moment to what's happening. We can be messy and imperfect and still be coming from love. We can be more in rhythm. I talked about that a couple episodes ago, like that actually, the opposite of presence isn't absence, it's vacancy, right? And for me, I was coming to realize like not being vacant means being in rhythm, right? It means being the cauldron, not being and acknowledging all the stuff that's in the cauldron rather than just trying to have the emptiest cauldron we can have, So we can build skill for this. And again, some days it's one of the hardest things. And some days we fail really big and really messily with it. But we can build skill for more of this healthy tension, for more of this healthy conflict, for more of this recognizing love as love and unlearning ideas of love that cause more rupture, that cause more exile, that cause more abandonment. And then we can start to get curious. Okay, where am I contributing internally and externally to cultures of love and care and repair and healthy rupture? And where am I perpetuating or contributing or avoiding dealing with cultures that fragment and exile and dehumanize? And this is really close to my heart, you guys. Because this is the medicine of these times. It really is. There are others too, but this feels like a pretty big one to me. So thank you. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you for joining me around this fire, kind of fiery, potent feeling fire, it feels like, but sometimes that's the medicine, right? So maybe just take a couple deep breaths in and out, just acknowledge what, if anything, is moving through your thoughts, through your body in the wake of this conversation, or really it was a monologue, but I trust that as you listen, your body, your system responds in some way, which makes this a conversation. Witnessing, to be a witness, right? To be a witness, witnessing is an active role. So tuning into this podcast is being in conversation in a way, even if only one of us is speaking, and even if it's not happening in real time. And it's important for it to happen in real time too. And it's important for everybody to be able to speak at times, but recognizing how much even just witnessing something actually shifts it. And when we're at the level of energy, time and space aren't linear. So even if you're listening to this later, I am speaking this for you, with you, even if I don't know who you are or when you'll listen, right? So yeah, just taking a couple deep breaths in and out and acknowledging the togetherness of this, even though it's slightly strange, perhaps this this exact format. Think of it as a together thing. And that said, too, you're welcome to write back to me. You're welcome to reach out. I'd love to hear, yeah, how did this episode leave you feeling? And I do actually still have some availability for some one-on-one sessions too. So if working with any of these messy emotions, if I don't know if reconfiguring is the right word, but if writing a relationship with any of those messier aspects of your humanity feels like a deep, deep yes for you, and you're curious what that might look like, doing that with me, reach out. Be happy to chat. So thank you to our fire for bringing us together, for softening us initially to give and receive and be in this conversation from our hearts with love and lightness and softness. Thank you also to this fire for reminding us what it is to consume and transmute and destroy and create. And thank you to you all for being here. Please share the episode if it spoke to you. And yeah, we'll see you next time around the fire. Hi, Kate here again. Thank you for gathering with us. Whether you've been here a while or found your way here thanks to today's guest, it means so much to me and the world I dream of to have you here. I hope you'll tune in for more of our conversations. We humans seem to be at a profound threshold and facing questions of deep impact for the future and the world. We need our full hearts and humanity as we sow seeds of change in these times of joy and heartbreak. I count myself lucky to be here now, around this virtual village fire, weaving our stories into a medicine with humans like you. As a community medicine space, this podcast is relational. It weaves webs of connection and mutual respect and care across time and space. If you appreciate and support the future we're seeding here, you can support the weaving of this web in a few ways. 1, share episodes with friends and family or online with your community. It also helps the podcast immensely if you like, rate, subscribe to, or follow the podcast where you watch or listen, so you get notified when new episodes drop and new listeners find us as they search. 2, join us on Patreon. Doing so supports conversations like the one you just heard and allows you access to live community gatherings and medicine circles and more as we continue to grow. It also helps me keep the space advertisement-free so the conversations stay intact as they are. If you have questions, suggestions, connections, or would like to find out more about working with me, you can find me online at www.wildsacredjourney.com, on Instagram at wildsacredjourney_KP, or email me, kate@wildsacredjourney.com. Until next time, from my heart to yours, I release today's fire with a prayer for our individual and collective wholeness, connection, and joy. May it be so.